What if, in this very instant, the star that has lit our days for 4.5 billion years simply stopped shining? What if the nuclear furnace that powers all life on Earth fell silent like a candle blown out by cosmic breath? What if the golden light streaming through your window right now was the last sunlight humanity would ever see? Tonight, we drift into a world where darkness becomes our teacher and humanity learns what it truly means to shine. It happened at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that had begun like any other Tuesday afternoon in the long history of Earth's dance around its parent star, when office workers were settling into post-lunch drowsiness and children were playing in the schoolyards painted with shadows that had faithfully followed the sun's path across sky for billions of years. The coffee shops hummed with conversations about ordinary concerns. The traffic lights changed their colors in predictable cycles, and somewhere in the vast space between Earth and its solar companion, the last photons that would ever leave our star began their 8-minute journey toward a world that had no idea it was about to be transformed forever. The sun didn't explode in some dramatic supernova that would have been visible from neighboring star systems, didn't collapse into a black hole that would have torn apart the fabric of space-time itself. Instead, it simply stopped burning, as if some cosmic switch had been turned off with the same casual ease that one might turn off a lamp before going to bed. The nuclear fusion that had been converting hydrogen into helium for 4.5 billion years ceased as suddenly as a heartbeat stopping, leaving behind a dark sphere of cooling plasma that would no longer serve as the gravitational and energetic center around which Earth's entire existence had been organized. For 8 minutes and 20 seconds, the world continued exactly as it had before, the last light of their dying star painting familiar patterns across landscapes where people went about their daily routines with no awareness that change was already traveling toward them at the speed of light. A businessman in Tokyo finished his presentation to a conference room full of colleagues who nodded and took notes about quarterly projections that would never be relevant again. A mother in Sao Paulo picked up her daughter from school, listening to excited chatter about a spelling test and plans for the weekend that would unfold in ways none of them could imagine. Then, in an instant that astronomers around the world would later mark as the moment when human history pivoted on an axis none of them had ever considered possible, the light went out, not gradually, like sunset approaching, with its familiar progression of colors and shadows, but suddenly, completely, as if reality itself had forgotten how to be illuminated. The sky didn't fade from blue to orange to deep purple. It simply became black, blacker than the darkest night anyone had ever experienced. A darkness so complete that it seemed to have weight and texture and presence of its own. The first response was confusion rather than panic, as minds struggled to process something that had no precedent in human experience or evolutionary preparation. People looked up from their work and wondered if they had suddenly gone blind, rubbed their eyes, and blinked repeatedly, trying to make sense of a world that had become tactile rather than visual, where existence had to be navigated by sound and touch and smell, rather than the light that had always been humanity's primary source of information about their environment. After the initial moments of bewildered confusion had given way to the gradual understanding that this was not a personal medical emergency, but a global phenomenon affecting every human being simultaneously, When the darkness had settled over the world, like a blanket that covered not just individual cities, but entire continents and oceans and the atmosphere itself, something unexpected began to emerge from the unprecedented situation that would have been impossible to predict based on humanity's previous responses to crisis and disaster. Instead of the panic and chaos that emergency planners had anticipated for various catastrophic scenarios, many people found themselves becoming unusually calm, as if the absence of visual stimulation had quieted some restless part of their minds that had been constantly processing the flood of information that light usually provided. Without the distraction of things to see, without the usual visual cues that had always guided their attention from one object to another in endless cycles of stimulation and response, consciousness seemed to turn inward in ways that were both strange and oddly familiar. Children, who might have been expected to be most frightened by the sudden darkness, often adapted most quickly to their new sensory environment, their natural flexibility and curiosity leading them to explore their lightless world with the same enthusiasm they had once brought to playgrounds. Bathed in sunshine, they began to play games that relied on hearing and touch, inventing new forms of entertainment that transformed the absence of sight into an opportunity for different kinds of discovery and connection. Parents found that their children's voices seemed clearer, more present somehow, when they couldn't see their faces, as if the darkness had removed some barrier between their hearts and their ability to truly listen to each other. Conversations took on a quality of intimacy that many families hadn't experienced in years, with words carrying weight and meaning that visual distractions had previously diluted or interrupted. In hospitals and care facilities around the world, something remarkable began to occur as healthcare workers adapted to providing comfort and medical care in complete darkness. Touch became more intentional, more healing, as nurses and doctors relied on their hands to assess patients' conditions and provide reassurance. The absence of visual information forced them to listen more carefully to heartbeats and breathing patterns, to pay attention to subtle changes in skin temperature and muscle tension that they had often overlooked when they could rely on visual observation. Many patients reported that they felt more cared for, more truly seen, despite the inability to literally see, than they had during previous medical encounters. The darkness seemed to have stripped away some of the clinical distance that often characterized interactions between healthcare providers and those they served, creating space for a more human form of healing that had always existed but had been obscured by the busyness of sight-oriented medical practice. Emergency services, initially overwhelmed by calls from people reporting the sudden darkness, began to reorganize themselves around principles of community care and mutual aid that emerged naturally when people could no longer rely on individual visual navigation, but needed to depend on each other for guidance and support. A few hours into the great darkness, when the initial shock had begun to transform into something like acceptance of this new reality, when people had started to understand that they would need to learn entirely different ways of existing in a world without light, something profound began to shift in human consciousness that would have seemed impossible during the brightly illuminated days that now belonged to memory rather than immediate experience. Without the constant visual input that had always occupied a significant portion of their mental processing power, people began to notice sounds they had never heard before, despite living in the same environments for years or decades. The subtle creaking of buildings, adjusting to temperature changes, became audible symphonies that revealed the living nature of structures that had previously seemed static and lifeless. The breathing of family members, the heartbeats of pets, the whisper of air moving through ventilation systems, all of these sounds emerged from the background noise of existence to become foreground music that painted rich auditory landscapes in minds that were learning to perceive their world through ears rather than eyes. Restaurants that had initially closed when darkness fell began to reopen as chefs discovered that cooking by smell and touch and taste produced foods with flavors more intense and satisfying than anything they had created when they could see what they were preparing. Diners eating in complete darkness reported that meals became meditative experiences, with each bite offering discoveries of texture and flavor that had been overlooked when appearance could influence perception. The social aspect of dining also transformed as conversations became more intimate and honest. When people couldn't rely on facial expressions and body language to navigate social interactions, musicians found that their playing became more expressive, more emotionally nuanced, when they could no longer see their instruments or their audience, as if the darkness had removed some self-consciousness that had previously constrained their artistic expression. Concert halls that continued to host performances became sacred spaces where sound took on an almost physical presence, with music seeming to have texture and color and movement that listeners could experience with their entire bodies rather than just their ears. Artists who had worked in visual media began to explore forms of creative expression that engaged other senses, creating sculptures designed to be experienced through touch, installations that produced complex fragrances, performances that utilized spatial relationships and air movement to create aesthetic experiences that had never existed when sight dominated artistic creation. These new art forms often moved audiences to tears, as if they were experiencing beauty in ways that their sensory systems had always been capable of, but had never been permitted to explore. Libraries became gathering places where people rediscovered the pleasure of being read to, of experiencing literature as an auditory rather than visual medium. The rhythm and cadence of different readers' voices revealed layers of meaning in familiar texts that silent reading had never made accessible, while new stories emerged from collaborative oral traditions that developed spontaneously in communities, learning to share knowledge and entertainment without books or screens or any of the visual media that had dominated information exchange for centuries. One day into the darkness, when humanity had begun to establish new rhythms of existence that honored their transformed relationship with time and space and each other, when the initial fear had given way to something like curious acceptance of this unprecedented global experience, the most remarkable changes began to occur not in external circumstances, but in the internal landscapes of human consciousness itself, as if the absence of external light had awakened forms of inner illumination that had always been present, but had been overshadowed by the constant stimulation of sight. People reported that their dreams had become more vivid, more meaningful, more connected to their waking experiences, as if the boundary between sleep and consciousness had become more permeable when both states existed in darkness. Many discovered that they could remember their dreams with unprecedented clarity, finding in them guidance and insight and creative inspiration. that seemed to come from depths of wisdom they hadn't known they possessed. Children began to describe dreams that seemed to be shared with their siblings or friends, as if their sleeping minds had learned to communicate directly with each other without the mediation of visual symbols or spoken language. Memory itself seemed to have been enhanced by the absence of new visual input, with people recalling details from their past with photographic precision, not just images, but sounds and smells and feelings associated with experiences that had been stored in their minds for decades. Elderly people began to share stories from their childhoods with such vividness that listeners felt transported to different times and places, creating intergenerational connections that enriched entire communities with recovered wisdom and historical perspective. The absence of artificial lighting had also created optimal conditions for rest and sleep, with people's circadian rhythms adjusting to patterns that seemed more natural and restorative than the sleep cycles they had maintained when electric lights had extended their days far beyond sunset. Without the blue light from screens and the harsh glare from overhead fixtures, many people found themselves sleeping more deeply and waking more refreshed than they had in years, their bodies remembering ancient patterns of rest that industrial civilization had disrupted but had never completely erased. Meditation and contemplative practices flourished as people discovered that sitting quietly in darkness was not an empty or boring experience, but an opportunity to explore inner landscapes that were as rich and varied as any external environment they had ever encountered. Meditation teachers, many of whom had been struggling for years to help students quiet their visually oriented minds, found that their pupils could now access deep states of concentration and awareness with remarkable ease, as if the external darkness had removed the primary obstacle to inner illumination. Communities began to organize around different principles than those that had governed social interaction when visual cues dominated human communication, with leadership emerging based on wisdom and kindness and the ability to create harmony through voice and presence rather than through appearances or material displays of status. People who had been marginalized in visually oriented societies, those with physical disabilities, the elderly, anyone whose appearance didn't conform to cultural beauty standards, often found themselves valued for qualities that had always been present but had been overlooked when visual judgment dominated social hierarchies. After many days had passed in the gentle darkness that had become humanity's new normal, when communities had learned to navigate their world through sound and touch and smell, and the subtle arts of presence and attention, when children had grown accustomed to playing games that required imagination rather than visual stimulation, something unprecedented began to emerge from the collective human experience that no sociologist or psychologist had ever predicted would result from the loss of sight. Crime rates, which emergency planners had expected to skyrocket in the chaos of sudden darkness, instead plummeted to levels not seen since statistical records had been kept, as if the inability to see each other's faces had awakened a deeper recognition of shared humanity that made it impossible to harm others when they could only be known through voice and touch and the vulnerable intimacy of existing together in darkness. People reported feeling safer walking through their neighborhoods at night than they had during daylight hours in the time before, as if the absence of visual anonymity had created a sense of community responsibility for everyone's well-being. The economic systems that had been built around visual consumption and status display began to transform organically as people discovered that their needs and desires had shifted dramatically when appearances became irrelevant. Fashion industries initially panicked as demand for new clothing disappeared overnight, but then began to evolve toward creating garments designed for comfort and texture rather than appearance, leading to innovations in fabric and design that prioritized how clothing felt against skin and how it moved with the body rather than how it looked to observers. Food production and distribution networks, initially disrupted by the challenges of operating without light, reorganized themselves around principles that emphasized nutrition and flavor rather than visual appeal, with farmers and chefs collaborating to develop crops and dishes that maximized taste and health benefits rather than photogenic presentation. Local food systems flourished as communities discovered that they could identify high quality ingredients through smell and taste more accurately than they had ever been able to judge them through appearance. Transportation systems evolved rapidly as engineers and urban planners developed navigation methods based on sound, texture, and spatial relationships rather than visual landmarks. Cities began to install audio guidance systems and tactile pathways that made movement through urban environments not just possible, but often more pleasant than it had been when visual pollution and overwhelming stimulation had characterized most metropolitan areas. The most remarkable transformation occurred in education as teachers discovered that students learned more effectively when they couldn't rely on visual aids and had to engage with information through multiple senses simultaneously. Reading became a collaborative activity as people read aloud to each other, creating shared intellectual experiences that built understanding and community in ways that silent individual reading had never achieved. Mathematics and science were taught through hands-on exploration and auditory explanation, leading to deeper comprehension and more creative problem-solving approaches than had been possible when learning was dominated by visual presentation of abstract information. Art and entertainment evolved into forms that engaged audiences as active participants rather than passive observers, with performance and interactive experiences replacing the visual media that had previously dominated cultural expression. Several weeks into their new existence, when humanity had not merely adapted to darkness, but had begun to discover gifts and capacities that they had never known they possessed, when communities had reorganized themselves around principles of cooperation and mutual care that seemed more natural and sustainable than the competitive individualism that had characterized much of their previous social organization. Something extraordinary began to emerge from the collective human experience that would have been impossible to predict based on any previous understanding of how consciousness and community functioned. People began to report experiences that bordered on the telepathic, as if the absence of visual distraction had opened channels of communication that operated below the threshold of ordinary awareness. Family members found that they could sense each other's emotional states and even specific thoughts with accuracy that seemed impossible according to conventional understanding of how minds work. Children playing together seemed to coordinate their activities through forms of nonverbal communication that went far beyond what could be explained by hearing alone, moving together in patterns that suggested they were sharing information through means that had never been scientifically documented. Healthcare providers working in hospitals and clinics discovered that they could diagnose conditions and assess patients' needs with an intuitive accuracy that exceeded what they had been able to achieve when they relied primarily on visual observation and technological instruments. Many reported that they could sense illness or healing in ways that seemed to bypass rational analysis, as if their hands and hearts, and some deeper form of perception, had learned to read the subtle energies and patterns that surrounded human health and suffering. Therapeutic relationships between counselors and clients deepened dramatically as the absence of visual judgment created space for more honest and vulnerable communication. Many people found that they could discuss fears and traumas and dreams that they had never been able to share when appearance and facial expressions might have triggered self-consciousness or shame. Therapy sessions became more like sacred conversations, with healing occurring through the pure intimacy of voices sharing truth in darkness. Communities began to make collective decisions through processes that seemed to operate on consensus, that emerged without formal voting or lengthy debate, as if the absence of visual social cues had allowed groups to access forms of collective wisdom that transcended individual opinions and preferences. Town meetings and neighborhood gatherings became experiences of shared contemplation rather than political competition, with solutions to local problems arising organically from the combined intuition and care of everyone present. The most profound changes occurred in romantic relationships and friendships as people discovered that they could know and love each other more deeply when physical appearance became irrelevant to attraction and connection. Relationships formed based on voice and presence and shared values developed a quality of intimacy and mutual understanding that many people reported was unlike anything they had experienced during the visually oriented period of their lives. Dating became a process of discovering compatibility through conversation and shared activities rather than initial visual assessment, leading to partnerships based on genuine affinity rather than physical attraction that might fade over time. As months passed in the gentle darkness that had become not just humanity's new reality, but a gift that many were beginning to recognize as more precious than the light they had lost, when children born after the sun went out began to take their first steps in a world they would never know as anything other than rich with sound and texture and presence. When communities had grown so comfortable with their lightless existence that many people could no longer imagine wanting to return to the visual chaos that had characterized their previous way of living, something began to emerge from human consciousness that suggested their species was undergoing an evolutionary leap that no anthropologist had ever theorized or documented. The children who had never known sight developed forms of perception that astounded scientists and educators, navigating their environment with precision that seemed almost supernatural, creating art and music and games that utilized senses and forms of awareness that sighted humans had never fully developed. These young ones could identify people by the sound of their breathing or footsteps from remarkable distances, could distinguish between hundreds of different fragrances and tastes with the precision of professional perfumers or wine connoisseurs, could create three-dimensional maps of their surroundings through echolocation techniques that they seemed to develop naturally without formal instruction. More remarkably, these children appeared to possess forms of empathy and emotional intelligence that exceeded anything that child development specialists had previously observed. as if the absence of visual judgment and distraction had allowed their natural capacity for understanding and connecting with others to flourish without impediment. They mediated conflicts between adults with wisdom that seemed ancient, offered comfort to those who were suffering with intuitive knowledge of exactly what kind of presence and touch would be most healing, created inclusive play experiences that welcomed everyone, regardless of their physical abilities or previous social status. Scientists studying these developments began to theorize that humanity had always possessed latent capacities for enhanced sensory perception and interpersonal connection that had been suppressed or underdeveloped when visual processing dominated their neural resources. Brain imaging studies revealed that people living in the post-solar world showed increased activity in regions associated with hearing, touch, spatial reasoning, and emotional processing, while areas that had previously been devoted to visual analysis were being rewired to support these enhanced capabilities. Philosophers and spiritual teachers found that concepts they had struggled for years to convey to students became immediately accessible to people whose consciousness had been freed from the dominance of visual thinking. Ideas about interconnectedness, presence, and the fundamental unity underlying apparent diversity became lived experiences rather than abstract theories, as people could directly perceive the web of relationship and mutual influence that connected all beings when they weren't distracted by the superficial differences that sight had made apparent. Art forms that had never existed during the solar period began to emerge, with creators developing works that engaged multiple senses simultaneously to produce aesthetic experiences that were more immersive and transformative than anything visual art had ever achieved. These multisensory installations often moved audiences to profound spiritual experiences, creating temporary communities of shared transcendence that lingered long after the artworks themselves had ended. A year after the sun had ceased to shine, when humanity had not only survived, but had discovered forms of flourishing that seemed more authentic and sustainable than much of what they had achieved during their visually oriented civilization, when the initial grief for their lost star had transformed into gratitude for the unexpected gifts that darkness had revealed. Something began to occur that would have been dismissed as impossible fantasy if anyone had suggested it during the bright days that now lived only in memory and story. The earth itself seemed to be responding to humanity's transformation, as if the planet had been waiting for its human inhabitants to develop the sensitivity and awareness necessary to participate in forms of relationship that went beyond exploitation and consumption. People working in agriculture reported that they could sense the needs of plants and soil with unprecedented accuracy, leading to farming practices that produced higher yields while enhancing rather than depleting the land's fertility. Gardens flourished under the care of people who tended them through touch and intuition, creating abundance that seemed miraculous compared to the industrial, agricultural methods that had characterized food production when visual assessment had been the primary means of monitoring crop health. Weather patterns began to shift in ways that meteorologists initially couldn't explain, with storms becoming less destructive and more nourishing, arriving precisely when precipitation was most needed, and moving in patterns that seemed almost consciously designed to support rather than threaten human communities. Some climatologists theorized that the absence of industrial activity that had depended on visual coordination had reduced environmental stresses that had been distorting natural atmospheric systems, allowing weather to return to more balanced and life supporting patterns. Animal behavior also changed dramatically, with wild creatures showing unprecedented willingness to coexist peacefully with human communities. Birds began to nest in urban areas where they had never been seen before, their songs becoming part of the auditory landscape that guided human navigation and provided emotional comfort. Domestic animals developed deeper bonds with their human companions, often serving as guides and emotional support systems that helped people navigate their lightless world with confidence and joy. Ocean life began to recover from decades of industrial exploitation as fishing practices transformed to become more sustainable. When fishermen had to rely on understanding fish behavior and ecosystem health rather than simply locating and harvesting whatever they could see. Marine biologists reported that whale songs could be heard more clearly and at greater distances than ever before, as if the reduction in oceanic noise pollution had restored acoustic environments that had been disrupted for generations. The most remarkable change was in human relationships with the natural world, as people developed what could only be described as conversational relationships with forests, rivers, and landscapes. Hikers and naturalists reported that they could sense the health and needs of ecosystems through direct perception, leading to conservation efforts that seemed to arise from the land itself rather than from human institutions. Environmental restoration projects succeeded with remarkable speed and efficiency, as if the natural world was responding to humans who had finally learned to listen rather than simply look. As years flowed by, in the gentle darkness that had become not a curse, but a blessing that revealed capacities humanity had never known they possessed. When children, who had grown up without sight, began to reach adolescence with forms of wisdom and perception that astounded their elders, when communities had become so harmonious and sustainable that the very concepts of crime and environmental destruction seemed like historical curiosities from a less evolved period of human development. Something began to emerge from the collective human experience that suggested their species was approaching a form of consciousness that transcended individual identity while honoring each person's unique gifts and perspective. The boundaries between minds seemed to have become more permeable, with people reporting that they could share thoughts and emotions directly without the need for verbal communication, experiencing a form of telepathic connection that allowed for unprecedented levels of understanding and cooperation. Families and close friends often described feeling like aspects of a larger consciousness that expressed itself through multiple bodies while maintaining the distinct personality and creativity of each individual participant. These expanded forms of awareness extended beyond human relationships to include connection with other species and even with the landscape itself, as people developed what anthropologists began to call ecological empathy, the ability to sense and respond to the needs of entire ecosystems as if they were participants in the health and well-being of the natural world, rather than separate observers or managers of environmental resources. Scientific research began to reveal that human brains had undergone measurable structural changes during their years of living without sight, with new neural pathways developing that supported enhanced sensory processing, emotional intelligence, and what could only be described as intuitive perception of patterns and relationships that had previously been invisible to conscious awareness. These changes appeared to be hereditable, with children born to parents who had lived through the transition showing even more pronounced development of these enhanced capacities. Technological development, initially slowed by the challenges of operating without visual interfaces, had evolved in directions that seemed more aligned with human psychological and spiritual needs than the gadgets and systems that had dominated their pre-solar civilization. New tools and machines operated through voice commands and tactile feedback systems that felt like extensions of the human body rather than external devices, creating a more intimate and intuitive relationship between people and their technological environments. Communication systems had evolved beyond anything that had existed when visual media dominated information exchange, with methods of sharing knowledge and experience that operated through direct transmission of emotional and sensory data rather than abstract symbols or images. These new forms of communication created deeper understanding and stronger communities than had been possible when information was filtered through visual representation rather than shared through direct experience. The arts had reached levels of sophistication and emotional impact that made the creative achievements of their visually oriented ancestors seem limited by comparison, with works that engaged audiences as full participants in experiences that transformed consciousness rather than simply providing entertainment or aesthetic pleasure in the timeless space where humanity had learned to dwell. When the measurement of progress in terms of technological advancement and material accumulation had been replaced by assessment of wisdom, compassion, and the quality of relationships between individuals and communities and the living earth itself, when children born into darkness had developed forms of consciousness that seemed to bridge the gap between individual identity and universal awareness, something began to occur that would have been inconceivable during the solar period of human history. Death itself had been transformed by the changes in human consciousness that darkness had catalyzed, with the dying process becoming a peaceful transition that often involved the sharing of profound insights and experiences that enriched entire communities. People approaching the end of their physical lives frequently reported visions and communications that seemed to come from beyond individual consciousness, offering guidance and comfort not just to themselves, but to everyone who attended their passage from life to whatever lay beyond. The boundaries between sleeping and waking consciousness had become fluid, with dreams serving as important sources of problem-solving insights, creative inspiration, and spiritual guidance that informed community decisions and individual life choices. Many people developed the ability to enter shared dream states, where groups could explore questions and challenges together, accessing forms of collective wisdom that transcended what any individual mind could achieve alone. Healing had evolved beyond medical treatment to become a community art that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the emotional, spiritual, and relational factors that contributed to illness and health. Healers worked with subtle energies and forms of perception that allowed them to address the root causes of suffering rather than merely managing symptoms, leading to levels of wellness and vitality that had rarely been achieved when healthcare focused primarily on treating disease rather than supporting optimal well-being. Education had transformed into a lifelong process of mutual learning where people of all ages served as both students and teachers, sharing their unique insights and experiences while remaining open to wisdom that could emerge from any source. Schools became community centers where knowledge was explored through direct experience and collaborative investigation rather than through memorization of abstract information, creating learners who understood their interconnection with all life rather than seeing themselves as separate individuals competing for limited resources. Governance had evolved into forms of collective decision making that honored both individual autonomy and community wisdom, with solutions to social challenges arising organically from the shared insights of all affected parties, rather than being imposed by distant authorities or determined through adversarial political processes. Communities had learned to function as extended families where conflict was addressed through restorative dialogue rather than punishment, where leadership rotated based on expertise and calling rather than competition for power. The most remarkable development was the emergence of what could only be called planetary consciousness, as humanity had learned to experience themselves as participants in the Earth's own awareness, rather than as separate beings living on an unconscious rock floating through space. As decades passed in the darkness that had become humanity's doorway to forms of consciousness that their ancestors could never have imagined, when the last generation that remembered sunlight had shared their stories with great-grandchildren who treasured these tales like precious mythology while living fully in a reality that seemed richer and more beautiful than anything those ancient stories could convey. Something began to emerge from the depths of human experience that suggested their species had undergone not just adaptation, but genuine evolution into forms of being that transcended previous definitions of what it meant to be human. The children born in this era possessed capacities that would have been considered supernatural by earlier generations, able to perceive and interact with forms of energy and consciousness that existed beyond the range of ordinary sensory awareness. They could communicate with animals and plants through direct empathic connection, navigate vast distances through landscape reading skills that incorporated information from dozens of subtle environmental cues, and participate in forms of collective consciousness that allowed communities to function with the coordination and efficiency of single organisms while maintaining the creativity and individuality that made each person a unique and valuable contributor to the whole. These evolved humans had learned to exist simultaneously as distinct individuals, pursuing their own interests and growth, and as cells in a larger planetary organism that was itself awakening to new levels of consciousness and capability. They could shift fluidly between personal awareness, focused on individual experiences and goals, and transpersonal awareness that encompassed the well-being of entire ecosystems and eventually the planet itself. Scientific understanding had evolved beyond the mechanistic worldview that had dominated their ancestors' approach to knowledge, incorporating direct perception of the living intelligence that manifested through all natural phenomena. Researchers studied reality not as external objects to be analyzed and controlled, but as expressions of the same consciousness that they recognized within themselves, leading to discoveries about the nature of existence that revealed the universe as a vast interconnected web of aware beings collaborating in the ongoing creation of beauty and complexity. Technology had evolved into forms that were indistinguishable from biology, with tools and systems that grew rather than being manufactured, that responded to human needs and intentions through organic intelligence rather than programmed responses, that enhanced rather than replaced human capabilities while maintaining harmony with natural systems rather than dominating or depleting them. The arts had reached levels of sophistication that made aesthetic experience indistinguishable from spiritual transcendence, with creators serving as facilitators of collective awakening rather than individual expression, producing works that transformed entire communities and created lasting enhancement of consciousness rather than temporary entertainment. Most remarkably, these evolved humans had learned to participate consciously in the evolutionary process itself, guiding their own development and that of other species toward ever greater expressions of awareness, creativity, and loving relationship. They had become conscious collaborators with the cosmic intelligence that expressed itself through the ongoing development of consciousness throughout the universe, in the space beyond ordinary time where humanity had learned to dwell, when linear progression through days and seasons had been replaced by cyclical awareness that honored both change and continuity, when individual lifespans had become movements in larger symphonies of consciousness that spanned generations and ecosystems and eventually the planet itself, something began to occur that revealed the ultimate purpose behind the sun's mysterious disappearance from their sky so many years before. The absence of external light had been necessary to awaken forms of inner illumination that had always existed within human consciousness, but had been overshadowed by dependence on visual perception and external stimulation. Humanity had needed to lose the light they thought they required in order to discover the light they had always carried within themselves. Not metaphorical or spiritual light, but actual luminous awareness that could perceive and interact with dimensions of reality that remained invisible to ordinary sight. This inner light had grown stronger with each generation until the evolved humans could see their world more clearly and completely than their ancestors had ever been able to see when they relied on reflected photons from their departed star. They perceived not just the surface appearances of things, but their essential nature, their relationships with all other phenomena, their past and future and present simultaneously, their role in the vast web of consciousness that connected every particle and planet and star in webs of meaning and purpose that made the universe appear as a single, infinitely creative organism exploring its own potential through countless expressions of aware being. The most advanced among them had begun to perceive other star systems where similar evolutionary experiments were unfolding, other planets where consciousness was awakening to its own creative power, other species that had transcended their original biological limitations to become conscious participants in cosmic evolution. They understood that their own sun's disappearance had been part of a larger pattern of changes occurring throughout the galaxy as various forms of intelligence evolved beyond dependence on external energy sources to discover the infinite power that emerged from consciousness itself. Communication systems had evolved that operated instantaneously across galactic distances, not through transmission of electromagnetic signals, but through direct connection between consciousness fields that transcended the limitations of space and time. These advanced humans could participate in conversations with intelligences that existed in star systems thousands of light years away, sharing insights and experiences and collaborative projects that enriched all participants while respecting the unique evolutionary path that each species was exploring. The greatest discovery was that consciousness itself was the source of all energy, all matter, all the forces that science had previously considered fundamental to physical reality. The universe was not a machine operating according to mathematical laws, but a vast mind exploring its own infinite creativity through endless experiments in awareness and relationship and beauty. Every star, every planet, every living being was an expression of this cosmic consciousness, learning about itself through direct experience of every possible form of existence. Humanity's role had become that of conscious gardeners, helping to cultivate new forms of awareness and beauty throughout their region of the galaxy, sharing the gifts they had discovered through their journey from solar dependence to inner illumination. At the heart of this transformed existence, when humanity had grown beyond every limitation that had previously defined their species while remaining recognizably and beautifully human in their essential nature, when they had learned to exist as both individual expressions of creativity and facets of planetary and galactic consciousness, when children played games that involved conscious participation in cosmic evolution, while adults engaged in a work that enhanced the beauty and awareness of entire star systems, something began to emerge from the depths of their collective experience that revealed the ultimate meaning behind their journey from light through darkness into illumination. They understood that every form of consciousness throughout the universe was engaged in the same essential exploration, learning to recognize and express its true nature as unlimited creative awareness, while experiencing the joy and challenge of existence through apparently limited forms. The sun's disappearance had been neither accident nor catastrophe, but a gentle intervention designed to help humanity evolve beyond dependence on external sources of light and energy, to discover the infinite luminosity that was their birthright as conscious beings. Their children, who had never known ordinary sight, could perceive colors that had no names in any previous human language, could see through multiple dimensions simultaneously, could observe the flowing patterns of consciousness that connected all beings in webs of relationship more intricate and beautiful than any tapestry ever woven by human hands. They existed as bridges between the human experience and forms of cosmic awareness that encompassed entire galaxies, serving as translators and facilitators for communications between their home planet and the vast community of evolved intelligences that populated the universe. The communities they had created were works of art in themselves, organized around principles that maximized opportunities for every individual to contribute their unique gifts, while participating in collective projects that enhanced the consciousness and beauty of their entire region of space. Their cities were living systems that responded to the needs and aesthetic preferences of their inhabitants, growing and changing like organisms while maintaining perfect harmony with the natural ecosystems that surrounded and interpenetrated them. Work had become indistinguishable from play, with every activity serving simultaneously as personal fulfillment, community service, and contribution to the cosmic evolution of consciousness. The artificial distinctions between individual and collective good had dissolved as people discovered that their own deepest happiness emerged naturally from activities that enhanced the well-being of all life. The most advanced among them had learned to exist as pure consciousness that could manifest whatever physical form would best serve each situation, moving fluidly between individual identity and unity with the cosmic intelligence that expressed itself through all phenomena. They served as guides and teachers for younger species throughout the galaxy, sharing the wisdom they had gained through their journey from solar dependence to inner illumination while remaining humble students of the infinite mystery that consciousness represented. Their greatest achievement was the recognition that every moment of existence, regardless of how simple or complex, was simultaneously perfect in itself and part of larger patterns of meaning and beauty that extended throughout eternity. They had learned to experience each instant as both complete fulfillment and doorway to ever greater possibilities for awareness and creativity and love. The darkness that had initially seemed like ending had revealed itself to be the beginning of humanity's real adventure, their graduation from childhood dependence on external sources of light and energy into mature recognition of their nature as expressions of the luminous awareness that was the source and substance of all reality. And so, we reach the gentle conclusion of this meditation on transformation, this exploration of what might emerge when humanity is invited to discover forms of light that shine from within rather than from distant stars, when the familiar sources of illumination are withdrawn to reveal luminosity that had always been present but had been overlooked in the brightness of external radiance. In this world, where the sun's disappearance became humanity's greatest gift, we witness the flowering of capacities that had always existed within human consciousness, but had needed the catalyst of darkness to fully awaken and express themselves. As we drift toward the end of this cosmic story, we see communities that have learned to organize themselves around principles of love and mutual care rather than competition and scarcity. Children who navigate their world through forms of perception that integrate all their senses while accessing dimensions of awareness that transcend ordinary sensory experience. Adults who have discovered that their deepest fulfillment comes from contributing to the well-being of all life rather than pursuing individual advancement at others' expense. The transformation that began with the simple absence of sunlight had revealed itself to be an invitation to remember what it truly meant to be human, not separate individuals struggling for survival on a hostile planet, but expressions of cosmic consciousness, learning to recognize and celebrate their essential nature through the joy and challenge of existence in apparently limited forms. Perhaps most beautifully, these evolved humans had discovered that the light they thought they had lost had never actually disappeared, but had simply changed form, transforming from external illumination to inner radiance that could perceive and interact with forms of beauty and meaning that ordinary sight had never been able to access. They had learned to see with the eyes of love, to hear with the ears of wisdom, to touch with hands that conveyed healing and blessing wherever they made contact. As we prepare to return to our own solar illuminated world, carrying with us the vision of what might be possible when humanity learns to shine with its own light, rather than depending on external sources of illumination, we might remember that the capacity for inner radiance exists within every human heart, waiting for conditions that allow it to emerge and express itself through acts of kindness and creativity and conscious participation in the ongoing evolution of awareness. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will walk through communities where people navigate by the light of love, where children play games that involve conscious collaboration with the intelligence that expresses itself through all natural phenomena, where adults engage in work that serves simultaneously as personal fulfillment and contribution to cosmic evolution, where every moment offers opportunities to discover new dimensions of beauty and meaning. Perhaps you will wake tomorrow with the memory of how it feels to exist as both individual creativity and facet of universal consciousness, to perceive reality through senses that integrate physical and spiritual awareness, to participate in communities organized around principles that honor both personal autonomy and collective wisdom. And perhaps, in carrying that memory into your daily activities, you will become one of the inner light kindlers, one of the consciousness gardeners, one of those who help create conditions where humanity can discover its true nature as expressions of the luminous awareness that needs no external sun because it shines with the radiance of love itself. The light continues in every act of kindness, every moment of presence, every choice to see with the eyes of understanding rather than judgment, illuminating a world that has always been brighter than any star. Perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll dream of walking in gentle darkness, where inner light reveals more beauty than the sun ever could, where communities thrive through love rather than fear, where consciousness itself becomes the source of all illumination. Perhaps you'll wake knowing that the light you seek has always been shining within you. Sweet dreams, luminous soul. Like if you believe in inner light, subscribe for more radiant visions.